This morning is a privilege to be able to introduce to you, he has served many roles, actually. As a retired pastor, Dick Bayard has served this church in many capacities. He is no stranger to writing sermons and preaching from this pulpit. I'm sure many of you have been blessed through those sermons, and also attended many of his Bible studies and even now grace groups. His leadership has blessed myself as well as many of you. But at 93, when he heard the Lord leading him to share his personal testimony, he turned to Pastor Steve's lay witness and preaching class to learn a new way of speaking to you all. And he has spent many months perfecting, putting down words to paper, his own personal story of faith. So I hope you will help me not only welcome him, but open your hearts to the blessing we are about to receive. Please welcome Dick Bayard.
But I have the switch. The older I get, the harder it is to turn one page. The book of Hebrews, chapter 12, there's this little thing about discipline. God deals with you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? But if you're without discipline, of which all of us have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. Yet to those who are trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Therefore, strengthen the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble, and make straight paths for your feet, so that the limb that's lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Hold on. Jack and I don't want to break your eardrums. Around this church, I'm mostly known as a retired pastor, but I wasn't ordained until I was 57. I want to share some of my life as a layman. Jack, can we turn this thing down a tiny bit? It seems to me like, that's better for me. Okay. I want to share some of my life as a layman, especially what Jesus has done in my life long before my call to ordination. So this is a lay witness. Though I didn't know him at the time, I've come to see that the process I went through was his form of discipline designed to lead me to become a different man than I was. I was the third of three boys growing up in the Great Depression, trying hard to measure up to my brothers. Bob, 6 years older, brilliant, mechanical, grew up to be a nuclear physicist who worked and built the reactor for the first atomic submarine. In my childhood, Bob seemed to have the gift of sarcasm. and he practiced it on me quite a bit. To this day, if I mess up, I can hear him, tone and everything. What in the heck did you do a dumb thing like that for? It was a lot easier to measure up to John, 3 years older, gifted machinist and mechanic who was teaching machine shop at Santa Ana City College into his middle 80s. Unlike Bob, John tolerated, befriended, and protected his tag-along little brother. And of course, I also had to measure up to Mom. She was the organizer and the ramrod of the whole family. And Daddy, who was out most of the time working to provide for his family in the Depression, ever since his business had gone belly up in 1929. I never heard anything about affection or love growing up. And to this day, I have absolutely no memory ever of having ever been hugged by either parent. I never saw expressions of affection between them either. Their marriage seemed to be a sort of a business arrangement, centered on their working together to build a family and survive the Great Depression. In school, I was always the smallest boy in my grade, the smallest one. Not strong, not well coordinated. I was the ultimate unathlete. I also seemed to be the favorite target of all the bullies. I remember walking home from kindergarten several days in a row, absolutely mortified by having wet my pants on the way home. Each of those days. Why? Some second graders had come into the restroom and were bullying me when I was there at the urinal, and I was never going to go back in that place again. So trying to stay through kindergarten and get home didn't work. Our home was what I would call a totally unreligious but very moral place. We learned some strong morals for living. Always tell the truth. Always tell the truth. Never take anything that doesn't belong to you. I also learned live by the rules and get it right, no matter how it feels. Stop that crying. Men never cry. If you don't stop that crying, I'll give you something to cry about. Just get the job done perfectly, and then you can really be proud. The only personal feelings we were allowed to express in our family were pridefulness and put-downs for those that didn't live up to our standards. So I learned some strong habits in those growing up years. Never express any feelings. Never express any feelings. That way I could avoid the ridicule that would always follow. Avoid all athletic activities at all possibilities. If I had to be in that baseball game, I knew I would fan out at the plate, and I always out in field played center field as far back that I figured nobody had ever hit a ball this far. But I also learned to search out the things that I could do reasonably well, work at them alone privately to avoid the ridicule, and to do them so well that I could be super proud when the job turned out okay. As an adult, I developed a totally perfectionist project builder mentality. And that's who I was. As a kid, I had always built my ship models very privately. And when a project turned out to be good enough to show off, I was intensely proud of myself. So I could arrogantly say, "See, I told you I was really good." But bragging was against the family rules. So I would say that sort of thing silently to myself while putting on a really good humility act. I was 23 when I began my first music teaching job up here in Kingsburg in the elementary schools. At USC Music School, I'd been taught to play the instruments, but I hadn't been taught much about the actual task of teaching. That left me with a problem of figuring out for myself how to teach. So my new profession produced a whole new level of insecurity for me. Building a group of kids into a performing group can't be done privately. Cannot be done. My perfectionist heart was really worried about failure and ridicule all the time. Also, as a 20-something, I became aware that I didn't really know anything about love or even affection, especially what it might feel like. I heard others talking about love, but I had no idea what they might be trying to describe. I had thoroughly trained myself to suppress all feelings and to concentrate only on logical and practical things. So when I wanted to propose to that beautiful 6th grade teacher, I had to be honest with her. I said to her, "You know, I don't really know what love is, but I'd sure like to study it with you." She said, "Are you proposing to me?" I said, "Well, yeah." She said, "Yes." So church life with Louetta has been my lifelong pattern ever since then. In those early married years, I instinctively tried to build our marriage on my parents' business model. It was the only model I had. But because of my experience with Ramrod Mom and mostly absent Dad, I was determined I was going to be the senior partner. In those days, what we would say is, "I'm going to wear the pants in my house." My beautiful, serene wife also, though, turned out to be a conflict avoider. So we had no real conversations about how things should go. She would agree to whatever I wanted us to do as a family, and then wouldn't carry out her part of it when I wasn't there to make it happen. She called herself a silent rebel, and that's what she was. In a few years, we came to Visalia from my job here at Mount Whitney High. And I also inherited the job of directing the choir at this church back when we were downtown on Main Street. As a staffer, my involvement in church was very strong, and I appeared to be a strong Christian. But I was aware that church attendance was not really a major influence in my life. I was there, but I was who I was because I had chosen to live by my secular family's values. And those values just happened to coincide quite well with the values of this church in the 1950s and 60s. Honestly, I thought I was one of the good guys in town. I try again. Oh, I'm back. Okay. I was sure that I didn't do any of those things that I knew to be immoral, illegal, or wrong according to my strong opinions. During the 1968 and 69 school year, I was having a personal crisis that I couldn't see the way out of. For several years, I'd been working a 5.5-day week. Some of you might relate to that. 5.5-day week. 8 to 5 days at Mount Whitney. Tuesday night and Friday night at Mount Whitney with the band activities. Thursday night at church with a choir. Saturday with either a band trip to a parade or teaching private lessons all day long to augment the income. And Sunday morning, a half day, here at church. I was running very short on sleep. My perfectionism was demanding that the music program always had to be better next year than it was this year. There was always that huge nagging worry that next year my music program might flounder because I knew I was losing my best musicians every year. They had the nasty habit of graduating. See if I can find my place again. My perfectionist drive also seemed to manifest in my body as I developed some strange physical symptoms that my doctor said were classical symptoms of anxiety. Also, I sensed that my kids were growing up with a mostly absent dad, just like I had, and I didn't want that to repeat. In the fall of 1969, we had a weekend event scheduled and so on, Lay Witness Mission it was called. A team of lay people from other Methodist churches would come in to share their personal testimonies with us, just as some of us have done and just as I'm doing right now. In that weekend, I was challenged about who Jesus was to me personally. Truthfully, I said I knew he was part of the scene here at church, but I don't have any idea how that could affect me. The visiting layman that had challenged me then said, "Think about this. Jesus claimed to be God. If he was God, you better listen to him. If he was not God, he was either a liar or crazy. You better get away as far as you can." That night at bedtime, I prayed, "Jesus, I want to believe you're who you said you were. Help me, please." And that was probably my first ever genuine, spontaneous prayer. And there were two results that I experienced, two specific things that I am very sure was his direct answer to that first prayer of mine. The next morning, my first waking sense was that there was something new inside my body, in here, where my heart is. It was about the size and shape of a BB. Like, the Red Ryder Daisy Air Rifle BB gun, BB. I couldn't actually feel something solid in here, but I sensed something foreign in here. It wasn't just a thought in my head. It was not frightening at all, but it certainly wasn't me. There was something new here. And whatever it was, it knew who Jesus was. And it began to grow in me, and within several months, every cell in my body knows who Jesus is, and nowadays knows that he's here. The second answer to my prayer was a really deep hunger to read the Bible. We were always urged to read it, and I'd never done much. But to read the Bible and learn what it might teach me about Jesus. I've always been a student, but this was different. It was insatiable. I spent every free moment immersed in that new Bible that I bought in about 1970. Same book. It was not a modern study Bible with the text above on the page and the explanation of what it's all about down below. It was just the text with the margins full of references to other passages that would impinge on the same thing that that particular verse had to say. A zillion of those margin references. Through that study, the total message of the whole Bible came alive to me. I could often see the situation in a given passage, and yet comparing it with other passages gave me a more complete understanding of the big picture of the whole Bible. I'm sure that that was also the work of that BB-shaped thing in my chest that knew who Jesus was and that had given me this hunger for the Bible study. Very soon, that huge ongoing worry about meeting my own demands for myself began to be replaced by a quiet confidence that Jesus was somehow now in charge of my activities. He was watching my doings and seeing the results, classroom, home, church. He would somehow communicate to me a goal for me. Whether or not I met that goal, he always seemed to communicate his personal approval of me, including all of my successes and failures. This sense of approval from Jesus seemed to cure those early anxiety symptoms. They just sort of disappeared, and they've never been back. Sensing Jesus' approval of me in my failures was a huge boost on my developing an understanding of what love might be. Louetta's willingness to link her life to mine in our marriage had begun that process. The silent rebel in her wouldn't discuss plans with me, okay, but she also wouldn't hassle me. She seemed to just exhibit respect for me. See if I can find my place again. I'll share this with you. I preached for 13 years in those two little churches over in Kings County. I never had a text. I had an outline. I just talked from it. But there's an age when the words don't come fast enough. I have a text. Besides, Steve needs it. Needs to approve of it before. Okay, where was I? In my growing understanding of the Bible's truths, I began to realize that I was treating Louetta as a sidekick rather than an equal partner. I began to confess and repent to Jesus whenever I sensed a wrong attitude toward Louetta. My saturation studying of the Bible brought another kind of experience into my inner life. I was hungry to understand all of the Bible and was applying its directions to my own personal life. So I'd read a directive there that would say something I should do, and I'd think, how do I go about doing that? If I'm doing a project of some sort and I want to do that, how do I go about doing that? And there was the same kind of a question. How do I go about doing that? And that question seemed to morph into a mental conversation, two-way conversation with Jesus. Answers to my questions would come to my mind in clear sentence form. For instance, I saw that I'm expected to forgive everyone and everything that has hurt me. Well, since the hurts from my school days were so pervasive, I was asking, how do I go about doing that forgiving? And Jesus began speaking his answers in my mind. He taught me directly in my living experience how to cooperate with him in prayer in order to begin the work that I had to do of forgiving those people. And it was really hard work. But the result was, while the memories of those childhood hurts still are here, matter of fact, when I started to work on this, I had to spend a couple of days getting them up, remembering them. The memories are here, but the hurt is gone. There's no pain left in those memories. Even the fear of being ridiculed, it's about gone. Every once in a while I'll be in a situation where it jumps at me, but I know what to do with it now. One time I was griping to myself about how Louetta wouldn't do what I wanted her to do. And Jesus spoke clearly in my thoughts. Stop telling her what to do. At that time, she was teaching third grade, and I was running an in-service teacher training program in our school district. So I said to Jesus, but she's always complaining. Every day she comes home and complains about those 3 little boys in her third grade class. He said to me very clearly, she doesn't want directions. She wants a sympathetic ear. So I changed my responses that day and for several days afterwards. Just listened sympathetically. Put down what I was reading and listened. By golly, in just a few days, she asked if I had any ideas of something she might do to remedy the situation. I suggested 3 possibilities, and she chose one of them. She thought a minute, and I'll try that one. Next day she came home and said, hey, it worked. That was the beginning of a new life of mutual love between us. And I finally was learning about love with Louetta as Jesus had demonstrated his love for me. I could actually feel my love for Louetta. And I knew that that was what I was feeling. Louetta reflected it back in spades the rest of our lives together. That blessed two-way love between us never diminished until she died a week after watching them fly that airplane into the World Trade Center. And that was a few months after her massive stroke. Those mental conversations with Jesus led me to another form of personal transformation that he began to work into me. My good guy self-image started to crack when he showed me his picture of some of my attitudes. One time, a student asked if I had gotten the item that I had promised him a week before. As soon as I said, I haven't had a chance yet, I heard in my head, that's a lie. The truth is you forgot it since then. Here I was, the guy who prided himself in always being totally honest, and yet I was clearly lying to keep my image clean. I could see that I was guilty of what Jesus condemned the Pharisees for. I was proud of myself for acting right and perfectly while having totally self-centered, judgmental attitudes about other people within me. Also, Jesus showed me other bad attitudes that I lived by, but I was unaware of until he showed me. For instance, I realized that I was super judgmental of anyone who failed to live up to my family's standards, while outwardly, as if they were just fine, inwardly judgmental of them. I had determined that as a teacher I would treat all my students equally, but inside they weren't all equal. I realized my public humility was a false face that I had created, and I was trying to hide my huge hunger for any and all compliments about anything I might have done. That hunger is mostly gone these days. Actually, I can say thank you to a person who has complimented me, and inside I'm saying thank you, Lord Jesus, because that's why it happened. I have to tell you, looking at yourself in a video is completely different from looking at yourself in a mirror. I'm right-handed up there. As Jesus kept healing my hurts and messing up and my messed up coping mechanisms, my inner attitudes about myself and others began changing. Nowadays, I find myself more empathetic and supportive. I often find myself defending somebody when a group of people are starting to badmouth them, starting to criticize them, and so on. Now my goal in my relationships is more about letting people be who they are. By the way, that is specifically one of those sentence things that I heard directly in that form from Jesus. Let people be who they are. Why? It's not my job to shape them up. It's his job to shape all of us up. And this has opened for me a pattern of helping others who are developing their own personal walk with Jesus. And this pattern usually takes the form of sharing what Jesus has taught me directly and urging them to open themselves more to his presence within them. My desire to share my testimony with you today has that same purpose. I believe he is eagerly waiting for each of us to set him as the ultimate director in our lives. And that is a step that most of us never quite take. Certainly many of us in this congregation are already moving that direction. Yet the most important part of his working in all of our lives still seems to be that each of us would consciously surrender our own self-direction to his control. Please let him develop that two-way conversation with you. It doesn't have to be sentences in your mind. He has infinite number of ways of communicating to us. Our problem is learning to find out what it is and then stay tuned to it. Please let him develop that two-way conversation with you by opening yourself to it. He's the master craftsman, and we are voluntary apprentices attached to him for our training and for our benefit. As for me, At 93, I find myself in a retirement community, diminishing physical abilities, and I'm interacting daily with over 100 people. And I find my life just as enjoyable these days as it ever was in any role, occupation, or situation. Today, I can truthfully say that old one-liner, boy, I sure ain't what I ought to be, but thank God I ain't what I used to be. What it says here on the paper is, I know this quiet joy that I live in these days is mostly because Jesus is the absolute center of my inner life as well as my outer life. But I've got to add one paragraph to this. I walked in this morning and we were singing, "Thank you, oh my Father, for granting us." That song. The first part of this service this morning, through that and through the hymn that we began with, I know what love is. And seeing some of my friends that I haven't seen for a long time expressing that to me, I know what love is. And at 93, because of this congregation, I know that I am loved, not just by God, but by people too. Thanks for hearing me.